common stumbling block that I have seen from my experience is that while people are get involved for the right reasons, the environment is structured around conflict. And everything is very conflict centric. And the vast majority of people who get deeply involved in the labor movement, what I've seen is a tendency to swing to the extreme of all managers are out to get us, all bosses are bad.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you are immersed in conflict day in and day out, that becomes your baseline.
Right.
And for many of these people, they are stewards who are handling grievances, right? They are constantly in this state of conflict with management. And unfortunately, that translates to so many other aspects, and it becomes the default for many people, which hinders the ability for a union to really speak to what's important. And to me, what's important is how do we help our members have a good quality of living? That's wages, benefits, and the factors of the workplace.
Yeah, and I think that it's again, it really is easy for, I mean, anyone that's been involved in a workplace, unionized or not, that is rife with conflict knows how much
Yeah.
that kind of like that taints the environment and how much that really makes it challenging and hard to see things with a clear view, and it can make things kind of difficult in general. But I think that when it comes to a lot of the issues that arise between organizations like the businesses and their unions, it is that in the assumption of the interactions, the negotiations, collective bargaining, kind of everything is kind of based on, and correct me if I'm wrong, James, but it's kind of based on this assumption that everything is a zero-sum game.
Well, it is. And because that's the way that we approach negotiations, right? We enter negotiations with the thought that in order for me to, as a, doesn't matter what side of the table you're on, in order for me to get something, the other person has to give it up, right? That's kind of the definition of zero sum is I gain by taking from somebody else. And that's how we largely approach negotiations from both sides of the table,
Mhm.
right? We need to, from the business perspective, it's we need to keep these people from taking from us. From the union perspective, is we need to take our fair share, right? And that perspective bleeds over to the negotiations at the table.
Yeah. And from the outside, that's really easy to see how that could be. But I don't know. Does it have to be that way?
There is going to be conflict. You have two groups that have differing objectives, right? Or at least we talk about them as differing objectives.
Mhm.
And I think one of the challenges to answer your question, the short answer is no. The long answer is no, but um, it doesn't have to be that way. We have to recognize that there's always going to be that give and take, that there's always going to be that that there's always going to be some conflict because our objectives do not align perfectly. What would alleviate a lot of the challenges is the development of common language, right? If as a business we could enter into negotiations with the labor union using the same language, it would help alleviate a lot of confusion, a lot of miscommunications. For example, we've talked about this a lot, and one of our big core theories is around what we call the 7x3 rule. And it's all about how the factors of your workplace need to be addressed through the lens of employees' expectations. 7 factors, 3 expectations. And this could actually be a really useful tool for both businesses and unions if to frame the conversation, right? So if we look at, so classic negotiation topic is wages,
Right.
right? That's always going to be on the table.
That's a big one.
That's a big one. If we can approach our conversation about wages using the same language of those expectations, that wages need to be competitive, they need to be sufficient, and they need to be equitable.
Right.
From a business perspective, you want your wages to be competitive, sufficient, and equitable, because if they are not competitive, then people are going to go to your competitors for that higher wage. If they're not sufficient, then as in not enough for people to actually accomplish their goals or to live off of, then they're going to be looking for other ways to supplement their income. And if it's not equitable, you're going to land yourself in a whole host of problems, you know.
Yeah.
So a business wants their wages to be competitive, sufficient, and equitable, because it's foundational, and you can't have success in many of the other business areas that we talk about, like engagement, motivation, productivity. All of these things are dependent on whether or not there's high or low levels of job dissatisfaction.
Right.
Unions want competitive, sufficient, and equitable, right? They want their members to receive wages that are competitive within the industry and within the region. They want them to be sufficient, and sufficiency is actually a big one for many labor unions, right? They need to be sufficient to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. And from a wages perspective, we're largely talking about, can I support myself and or my family on the wages that I earn? And they need to be equitable. And the equitable piece is actually where most of the union's day-to-day activities take place, ensuring that things are equitably applied. That's where the role of local shop stewards and those activities play a big role in that equitable aspect. But just by framing our conversations through this same language, we will differ on what we consider to be competitive. We will differ on what we consider to be sufficient. But at least if we're using the same language, then we can talk about things in terms that both sides understand. And we know we have a common goal now, that we are trying to reach an agreement on what is competitive. We are trying to reach an agreement on what is sufficient, rather than we're trying to reach an agreement on wages as a big, broad topic. We can be more focused in our communication, in our conversations, and define those things together, those expectations.
Yeah. So what's interesting, so I give a lot of like talks, a lot of webinars, I speak at a lot of conferences and stuff like that. And one of our major areas that I've been talking about a lot this past year has been the kind of fallout of the Great Resignation,
Right.
the high turnover rates kind of happening globally. And a lot of the conversations that I have, the talks that I give, and the conferences, whenever, is often around the 7x3 rule. Again, competitive, sufficient, and equitable. And it's always interesting. I always love talking to people after we give a webinar, after we I speak at a conference, because people are always like, "Wow, yeah, we've always been so focused on competitive, and that's where all of our efforts are. But now that we know the expectations of the workforce have changed, and they really expect sufficient and equitable to be as important as competitive." And so what's really cool, and actually kind of I think one of the things that kind of opened up our eyes, is like I don't think you and I originally always thought about competitive, sufficient, and equitable in the union concept until people approached us about it. They're like, wow, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. Like, I'm an ERO for a union. And that idea is really interesting. And then I've spoken to HR heads or people responsible high up in different companies, and like, yeah, that language actually is something that would allow us to find that middle ground between talking with our unions and everything like that.
I want to be clear. This is not there are no like golden bullet solutions, right? Like
Right.
it's not this one, do this one. Companies hate this one trick, the
Clickbait.
clickbaity. Yeah. It it's a starting point,
Yeah.
right? You need to enter into negotiations in good faith on
Right.
both sides. And when you don't, a whole host of things go wrong
Yeah.
very, very quickly.